a lot of the big brands that are actually benefiting on the basis of a centralized capitalist system, they're looking at blockchain with this kind of, happy eye and sad eye, or with this kind of, dubious perspective as well as optimistic perspective, because it could go either way. And I think a lot of the big stakeholders are in it in order to be part of the way that this development unfolds. And ideally, and maybe they're trying to also influence it so that it benefits them and it wouldn't necessarily be to their detriment. But there's a lot of the kind of original activists in the blockchain kind of community that would say that this is a great mechanism to address a lot of the kinds of evils of the capitalist system. So inequality, the way that the top 1% own X much as the bottom percent and so forth. There's a whole bunch of reasons of why disintermediation, which is what blockchain enables, can potentially be addressing a number of societal concerns. And this is then going beyond just any one cryptocurrency. It's actually looking at the way that society is organized. I might just leave it at there, because otherwise it would be quite a long ramble, but I think you just get like a flavor that I actually don't think it's necessarily entirely good or entirely bad. It's a piece of technology. It depends on the way that it now unfolds, which is great that there's so much interest now, because the more people take an interest and actively try and shape the direction it goes, the better it is.
I might just add, one of the things that we're seeing around, well, one of the best use cases for blockchain technology is supply chains. So if you actually have provenance in any of the products that you are interested in purchasing, if you believe that something is organic, right now you require a certificate on the package to verify that that actually is organic. And that is as far as you can actually inquire. Basically, technology such as blockchain provides a mechanism for you to go deeper into that process through whether there's a QR code on the packaging that actually links you back through its supply chain to give you that transparency about where this product has come from, what pesticides are being used, what water use is being used. These are sort of the ambitious goals of blockchain technology. And this is an important element because, as Marcus is involved with Beef Ledger, Australia's produce are of high demand across the world. But what happens is when they go into export markets, they can be tampered with. And when they're tampered with, it reduces our reputation and puts us at risk in terms of our trade and everything like that. So blockchain and supply chains are a great way for brands to really build out a trusted relationship with their buyers in their market. Plus also remove intermediaries out of the supply chain that don't add any value but are actually taking money out of the process. So we get asked a lot, what is the best use for blockchains apart from cryptocurrency? It's supply chains, because of the area of needing to have trust and provenance in the products that we use. And I think we'd hope that once we start to get a clear transparency, we as consumers will make a determination which brands survive and which brands will actually have to change their behaviour, such as H&M. Fast fashion has a massive conversation around the world at the moment because of their consumption. But what if we could actually choose? I don't personally buy H&M and I will never do that because I know personally that they screw up the environment. But we've got young generations that don't get that. But what if we put that knowledge in their hands, and therefore these brands have to alter their behaviour because they are acting bad. And there's pros and cons about the whole, having that level of transparency. But that's where I see the idea of trust coming into play around a really important issue. And I know that is, from an environmental perspective, that is one of the most important things on this planet, around how do we actually address climate change, how do we look at green financing in a different way so we can actually truly start to address these problems. It's probably a nice segue for you, John.
I know, I'm happy to go to the next question, that's right.
Yeah.
Conscious of time.
Keep rolling. Katrina, back to you. You co-founded Civic Ledger, which focuses on using blockchain to improve people's interactions with government.
Yes.
Why is blockchain needed to do this as opposed to other technologies that maybe currently exist?
We actually got involved with blockchain and government. For a start, I come from government. I spent 20 years working in state government and 8 years in Brisbane City Council. So one of the areas that I found frustrating working in government was the lack of data sharing. One data set would sit on an Excel spreadsheet and then you'd have to recreate another set of data, another set of data. And the amount of money that has been consumed by rail money into improving those systems that are built by big legacy companies and that sort of stuff. It's a long story, I haven't got into it, but when I got myself involved with this technology, government seemed to be a natural place for us to operate. The reason why is because life events are wrapped in paper. As soon as you're born, you get issued a certificate. When you die, you're issued a certificate. All that requires is a sense of proof. Did this happen? Are you who you are? Are you the right person to have this service? Are you the rightful person that can actually go camping, go fishing, drive a car, park your car, blah, blah, blah. All those events actually would cost us as a taxpayer, as a ratepayer, in terms of red tape and efficiency. So we look at blockchain technology from an efficiency perspective. How do we actually create what we call federated data? And when we say the word federated, in the context of blockchain, it means it's been verified. So instead of saying, there's a piece of data, it's come out of an Excel spreadsheet, somebody's created it, let's trust that. What we look at is authoritative sources to verify data, who has what, put that into a registry, and then allow that to what we call basically be claimed by the ratepayer or the citizen, their actual right, and then they can do something with it. We sort of see the reason why government is the best place to start is because in Australia there's about 811 million transactions happen every year between us and government, and those are triplicated, go over and over again. And also we know that governments are really great at doing budgets and they're really great at public policy, but they're really shit at service delivery. I know. We've got to give. See, the thing about Australia, and this is because I do a lot of travel around the world, and I go into emerging countries. Australia's very lucky. We don't trust our politicians. We don't, but we do trust the government services that we do get. We do trust our fireys and our ambos and our teachers and that sort of stuff. We trust them, but we don't trust the process to which we actually get those services. So that's why the private sector is there. So we sort of see that the role of government in the future with this technology is a facilitator of new markets and new economies, whereby the digitalisation of services to remove double spend will actually allow us as citizens to start to self-organise and self-manage the way we want to interact with government because these services are digitalised. That is an enormous potential, and we're not just sitting here having this conversation with ourselves. We see conversations that are happening all around the world in government space. Australia's just a little bit slow, and the reason why is because we have it so good here. We do, and I know that's really, everyone sort of goes, go to Manila, go to Bangkok, go to emerging democracies where this doesn't exist. We're very, very lucky here. So we saw that blockchain technology early days could have applications because it's around transactions and it needed to federate data. And since then we've been working with really interesting problems such as the Madeline Basin on how to commoditise digitalised water so we get transparency in the price because that doesn't exist, and we need to know what the true value of water is so we can protect it as a planet. And the other thing that we're really interested in, which we are working on with the Australian government, is patent rights. So how do we digitalise patent rights, lock them into a registry, but then create into P2P marketplaces so rights can actually be monetised without needing government interference, which is a huge thing for startups. So I'm a startup, I have IP, it sits on my balance sheet, and I'm unable to, unless I engage an attorney, to actually monetise or non-exclusively license those that our knowledge, I guess, into an open market. But local government is one of the best places to use this technology. We've tried working with Brisbane City Council, but for them it's a bit scary because it's not necessarily about us, it's about because it creates transparency internally, so they can't actually sit opaque budgets anymore. Once you start using this technology, every transaction will have its value attached to it because you'll actually be able to see what's being used. So public policy will have to step up, transparency around budgets will have to happen. It's not going to happen in Brisbane City Council. So we'll go work with other local governments and put them under pressure to actually do this.
Thank you, Katrina. So we're going to cross over into a use case of blockchain technology in politics currently in Australia. So there is a party called the Flux Party, and they're enabling bottom-up kind of design processes through a voting system that gives Australian citizens that are enrolled in their system one vote for each bill before Parliament. So the software allows you to swap your votes in issues you don't care about for ones that you do. And this represents an issue-based direct democracy system. They apply blockchain in relation to voting transparency, so all votes are recorded on a public ledger, and that's to give transparency around their voting process. So, Jono, how do you think blockchain may potentially change political systems in the future?
Great question. I can talk all day about this. I'll try and be concise. First off, though, you have way more faith in government than I do. I think I think it is broken fundamentally as a structure, and I think the groups or the demographics in society that most get screwed over by our system are least visible in this space and in these conversations, and I think it's important not to lose sight of that. So obviously, I'm really excited about direct democracy and online stuff and giving people a vote, etc. But I think it is naive and arrogant to lose sight of the fact that any system is only as good as the culture and the values that underpin it, and that no system is values neutral. So I don't know a great deal about the Flux model, but what's interesting to reflect on about Flux is that part of the value set that underlies that is this idea of trading votes and saying, okay, people don't want to vote on every single issue, and some people are better qualified to make decisions about certain issues, so we'll let them trade votes and collect votes, etc. But what the value that sits under that is this idea of privileging expert voices and saying that person is an expert in town planning, that person is an expert in sustainability, let's give them more voting power within those realms. But I think we actually do need to push back against that, because to some extent that's still reifying certain knowledge holders and certain power holders in society and disempowering others. And what I think what's radical and transformative about liquid democracy is saying to every single citizen, no, your voice matters, you should engage, you can engage, your thoughts and perceptions as a citizen are valuable. And so, for example, in urban planning, what you often see is like the traffic planners and the town planners will say, we need to spend a lot of money on this big road project because that's what's important to people and that's what the data tells us, and we've looked at this algorithm of traffic flow and that's going to make the biggest difference. If you actually go and ask local residents who don't have all that expert knowledge, etc., they'll say the most important thing to them is fixing up these small pedestrian crossings. And for the price of that one big road project, you can fix 1,000 small pedestrian crossings, and actually the experts sometimes get it wrong. And that's for a whole range of reasons. But I think it's interesting with, say, the Flux model. The Flux model is not values neutral. It is on some level saying we want to design a system that's outcomes focused but allows people to trade votes kind of like in a marketplace, and then give that power to people who are perceived as being best able to exercise that power, which is not so different from our current hierarchical government systems. And I think we need to recognise that any system which concentrates and centralises power is still going to be vulnerable to co-option, manipulation and control by corporate interests. And so it's naive to forget that the corporate sector is amazing, like it's shit at a lot of things, but it is really innovative and flexible at manipulating government and at manipulating decision-making power. And I think we need to remember that capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, is inherently undemocratic. You can't water that shit down, you can't compromise it, you can't tweak it around the edges. You have to recognise that where there is profit to be made from manipulating the system, the corporate interest will always find a way to do so. And we saw that with, like, direct democracy, giving people a vote is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. There are lots of countries that have citizen-initiated referenda and plebiscites and ways that residents or citizens themselves can say, here's a proposed law, everyone vote on this proposition. But what often happens is that if the corporate sector can't manipulate the politicians directly, they just spend big money on these sort of broad, shallow advertising campaigns to manipulate the populace. And that's a common critique of traditional direct democracy, is that risk of majoritarianism and people making uninformed decisions. It's still harder to manipulate an entire population than it is to manipulate a few politicians. So that's still a step forward. But I think we need to remember that a system which says to people, you can be engaged on some issues and not engaged on others, and defer your voting power to those experts, still reinforces political disengagement in certain fields. And so what if we have a situation where a whole bunch of people say, oh, I'm not qualified to make a decision about refugee and border protection stuff, because there are experts who know about migration patterns and there are experts who know about border security, and so I'll trust them to make that decision for me. And so we're still giving up our power and essentially ceding some authority. The defenders of those models would say, no, you can choose whether or not to give up your power. You can make an informed decision as to whether you want to make that decision yourself or you want to give it over to someone else. But what I've learned, even in the small direct democracy experiments I've been using, is that people simply don't have time to engage with every single decision. And it's not just the decisions of voting on a specific law, but it's the very many small exercises of power that government representatives like myself make every single day. When in a system where people are working 40, 50 hours a week, they've got so many competing demands on their time, they don't necessarily have time to engage meaningfully with everything. So I think we need to be really mindful of setting up new systems that create the illusion of democracy, the illusion of control, the illusion of engagement, but simply shift power from one privileged sector to another, rather than genuinely decentralising it across the whole population. Sorry, that was a long rant.
Can I just ask though, do you see any utility around the use of public chains for voting transparency and potentially like scaling something like that up into maybe major parties or in the political process itself?
Well, I mean, from my understanding with Flux, because they are a legitimate political party, you can actually join them for free. They actually have been on the Senate a number of times. From my understanding is that they're actually saying the voting up, like if you don't want to participate in a vote, you can actually put it out. You can actually sort of put it into the market. But they're actually an issues-based democracy. So what they're trying to do is change the way we have a two-party system here in this country, because I don't feel that that's actually working. So Flux are trying to say, well, let's move away from a two-party approach and look at it from an issues-based voting mechanism. So we as citizens can actually vote on an issue rather than on a person or on a party. And if you are a very activated person,